You've also suggested that Anthony Albanese should self-refer his dealings with Qantas boss Alan Joyce to the NACC. Is it appropriate for NACC commissioners to accept Chairman's Lounge membership from Qantas themselves, given the potential they have to investigate these issues?
Look, I just think all of these things are red herrings. There are two questions the Prime Minister has to ask. One is that when he was Transport Minister of our country, did he pick the phone up to the CEO of Qantas and ask for a free upgrade? That's the question that he refuses to answer. Now, he can tie himself in all sorts of knots, but the reality is that he needs to answer that fundamental question. The second question is, given the very friendly, long-standing relationship between Mr Joyce and the Prime Minister, what were the circumstances around the Prime Minister's decision to not allow Qatar Airways into Australia? If Qatar was flying on routes from Perth to Sydney or Perth to Melbourne or Perth to Brisbane at the moment, people in WA, people in the Northern Territory and in other parts of the country would be paying lower airfares. But the Prime Minister made a decision which wasn't properly explained at the time, which starved Qatar of the opportunity to come into our market, reduced competition and therefore has held up the prices of airfares for too long. And we don't know why the Prime Minister went against the advice of the department or why the Prime Minister went against the advice of Minister King and made the decision to exclude Qatar. But what we do know is that the Prime Minister had a very significant and now declared personal friendship with the CEO of Qantas, who ultimately was the beneficiary of the decision taken by the Prime Minister. And again, the Prime Minister has to answer that question, as he does the first question about did he pick the phone up to Alan Joyce and ask for the free upgrades or not? It's a pretty simple question to answer.
You spoke yesterday about a concern that a lot of mining companies are now deciding not to invest in WA and choosing to invest in foreign areas. Is this a genuine concern that you've heard from industry leaders and stakeholders, and are there any specific projects or companies that you are referring to?
Well, there are many companies that we've spoken to who have given us that indication, and there will be many that you can see who are investing in Africa right now who, with global demands on their capital, and their capital's limited, they've taken a decision not to invest in Australia, and that is absolutely the fact. We've spoken to the Japanese, to the Koreans and others who are worried about sovereign risk in our country for the first time. They see a government with a renewables-only policy that is so distracted by inner-city voters in Sydney and Melbourne, where they're in a tussle with the Greens. They are making decisions which are making it harder to invest in our country. And if we don't have the Rio Tintos of the world paying $10 billion a year in taxes and royalties, we don't have a prosperous country. What is the replacement income if we close mining down, as Mr Albanese and Tanya Plibersek seem intent on doing? I want this industry to expand. I think there is huge demand for our commodities. I want manufacturing to re-establish in our country, but it won't do it if it's just relying on wind and solar. And that's why we've been very serious about putting forward the nuclear proposal, which I think should be supported on a bipartisan basis, as the Labor Party supported the Liberal government when we signed the deal with the United States and the United Kingdom in AUKUS. There is no logical or intellectual argument that the Prime Minister can put as to why he's opposed to nuclear, other than he's worried about losing votes to the Greens in Sydney and Melbourne. And it's detrimental in its impact on our country. And I think the Prime Minister, frankly, should stand up and show some leadership. And his continuing weakness is doing a lot of harm to our country.
Pilbara is home to a unique housing crisis. It's exacerbated by high development costs, a large proportion of company housing that restricts supply for non-industry workers. How would a federal coalition government address those concerns?
Well, we've just announced, as you know, a $5 billion program, which is targeted at bringing 500,000 more homes online. And this is a really significant issue locally, and Melissa Price has spoken to me about this in the last 24 hours, but before that as well. She's brought it up regularly in Canberra. And there is a difficulty, of course, because trying to attract a workforce into a community that is remote, that doesn't have housing, just doesn't add up. And so the $5 billion that we've put on the table would allow some of the roadblocks at the moment to be overcome. So in some instances where the local council doesn't have the balance sheet or can't afford to pay for the infrastructure or for the sewerage or for the road upgrade, our plan is designed to put money into that project, to make it stack up, to get the land developed, to get the houses built, and particularly for a lot of young Australians at the moment who have lost the hope and the aspiration of home ownership under the Albanese government. I want to restore that dream again. I want young Australians, as I did when I was much younger, to be in a position to afford a home. We've got young Australians at the moment under this government who are putting off having children because they can't afford to save for a deposit, to pay rent and to raise a family at the same time. And that's not what our country is about. Our country needs to get back on track, and that's exactly what we intend to do after the next election.
You've said that it's difficult to get new mines approved because of excessive regulations, but we've got groups like the UN who believe that there aren't enough environmental and cultural protections here in WA. How would a coalition government balance the interests of speeding up those approvals and also protecting cultural heritage?
Well, we have, as I said before, an established market in this country. This is not as if we're talking about first-time operators who are shonky operators who are coming from one industry into mining because they think there's a buck to be made. And this nonsense that you hear people talk about, they're just digging stuff out of the ground and throwing it on a ship, and and somehow a company like Rio generates an income which means that they have to pay $10 billion a year. We have a sophisticated sector. We have a world-leading sector. We have a sector in the mining industry here in WA predominantly, but in Queensland and New South Wales and across the country otherwise, which understands the environmental laws. They have a well-established and mutually respected relationship with Indigenous owners in local areas. There are difficulties from time to time, there's no question about that, but all of that can be dealt with professionally. And in that environment where we have world-renowned partners to work with in Rio, in many of the other companies who are working here in WA, then I think there is the opportunity to look at what the reality is on the ground and the success that's being achieved and being able to replicate that in other sites. And with all due respect to international observers, when you look at some of their objectives and some of their competing interests, then it's no wonder I don't think they've got an objective perspective on what's happening here in Australia.